They called me receptionist. That was all. I was the carpet on which they cleaned the muddy shoes of their ego. The girl with the automatic smile. The mechanical good morning. The one who answered calls with a sweet voice even when my stomach burned with hunger because my salary barely paid the rent. I remember the first day I stepped into that imposing glass building in New York. The automatic doors opened for me as if it were an initiation ritual to be humiliated. The lobby had Italian marble, giant chandeliers, and the air conditioning so cold it seemed to want to freeze any trace of humanity. But I had no choice. I needed that job. I needed the check at the end of the month. In the first few months, they treated me like a disposable trinket. They threw folders on my desk without looking at my face, complained if I misspelled a name on a name tag, laughed at my heavily accented English when I made a mistake. I once heard the vice president say, loud enough for me to catch every syllable, that I would never make it past reception. I'm glad he said that. At that moment, something inside me ignited, like a coal fired by gasoline. I started coming home every night and studying. I took online courses. I invested every spare penny in certifications. I read company reports that the executives themselves ignored. While they drank expensive whiskey and made jokes about who I was or wasn't, I devoured spreadsheets, contracts, market trends. I saw every laugh they gave as a bet against me, and I intended to charge dearly for every smirk. The day things started to change was almost silent. I walked into the CEO's office to deliver some mail and, by accident, I caught sight of his monitor. They were about to lose a multi-million-dollar contract due to sheer incompetence. I left there with my heart pounding so hard I could have sworn it echoed down the hallway. And that was when my silent revenge began to take shape. It wasn't just going to be a personal victory. I planned to turn the tables in such a big way that they would never dare underestimate a receptionist again. I knew I couldn't act in a hurry. That company was a corporate monster with tentacles in every department, but it was also lazy, bloated by its own arrogance. They didn't notice when I began to make silent friends with people far beyond my receptionist badge. The outsourced accountant who was always complaining about cash flow. The lady from legal who hated her boss and would blurt out valuable details while smoking on the terrace. Even small suppliers who would tell me about missed deadlines and mysteriously adjusted invoices. I put each fragment together like someone putting together a jigsaw puzzle, drawing a secret map of the rot that held that marble building together. Meanwhile, I kept smiling behind the counter, scheduling meetings, answering calls, taking messages. It was so easy to fool them because they never looked at me as someone capable of engineering anything. I was invisible, and that gave me power. It took me 2 full years to build up my arsenal. During that time, I earned solid certifications in financial management and international contracts. I sold almost everything I owned to pay for an MBA that I took at night. I slept 3 hours a night, but with each diploma on the wall of my tiny apartment, I felt like my time was coming. By the time I was done, I had put together a dossier so detailed of internal fraud that it could bring down the board of directors in a matter of days. But my goal wasn't just to expose their garbage. I wanted to take it all. So I started looking for investors who dreamed of getting into the industry and needed someone with inside information to open the siege. It wasn't hard. Every market has vultures waiting for the slightest sign of weakness to pounce. I presented reports, spreadsheets, and timelines that showed exactly how the company could be swallowed up if the timing was right. I left each meeting with better proposals, preliminary contracts ready to be executed as soon as I gave the signal. The trigger came on a Tuesday morning, when the tax department was unexpectedly audited by federal agents. I wasn't there by chance. It was my complaint that triggered the entire operation. While they were taken one by one to private rooms, documents were seized, computers confiscated, and the entire building plunged into silent panic. I, the little receptionist, stood behind the counter, feigning shock, offering glasses of water to executives who were sweating cold. While in the pocket of my blazer, I felt the definitive contract, the letter that would make me the majority shareholder, buying the dispersed capital of the company that was now imploding. I signed it that same day. And within 48 hours, everything was mine. I walked through the same revolving door, but this time not to check in. I walked in for my first meeting as owner. Watching as pale faces tried to process the fact that the woman who answered the phone now ruled them all. The vice president, who said I would never be more than a receptionist, couldn't even look me in the eye. I made a point of calling him by his full name and asking, in front of the assembled board, if he was ready to review the quarterly results with me. His voice was shaky, almost childish. That was just the beginning. In the months that followed, I restructured the entire company, fired the most toxic figures, and quietly rewarded those invisible employees like me who had carried the job on their shoulders without recognition. The building still had the same Italian marble, the same chandeliers, but now every detail belonged to me. And ironically, I started to be called Madam President. The feeling of walking through those hallways now, as an owner, was strangely calm. There was no broad smile on my face, nor the euphoria typical of someone who achieves something so great. There was only a cold tranquility, as if I had reached an inevitable destiny. I watched people look at me with terrified respect, and in each frightened expression I saw the vivid memory of the days when I was ignored, treated like expendable furniture. And that was exactly what fueled me to continue. My first acts were not just corporate cleansing, they were precise surgeries to cut the rotten roots that sustained internal corruption. I called long meetings, hours locked away with advisors and directors who sweated every time I opened a new dossier. Many fell without even trying to fight. Others begged to keep their positions, offering favors that only further exposed how dirty they were. At the same time, I began to reverse contracts that the previous management had signed out of pure short-term greed, without regard for sustainability or long-term reputation. I renegotiated monstrous debts, used my privileged information to double competitors, and began to acquire smaller companies that complemented our services, creating an ecosystem that made me indispensable in the market. It was almost poetic to see newspapers that previously only mentioned the company because of scandals now call me a fierce strategist. But I didn't do it for headlines. I did it because each step consolidated my power. One night, alone in my new office, a large room with a panoramic view of Manhattan, I sat in my leather chair and closed my eyes. I remembered the sound of the broken clock in the reception area, which had ticked irregularly when I was just the girl behind the desk. It was the sound that had accompanied my long afternoons, taking appointments for people who didn't even know my last name. Now, that ticking seemed to have been left behind in another life, in a world where I was too small to be noticed. I opened my eyes again, stared out at the brightly lit city, and felt something almost like peace. But it was a dark peace, born of the fact that I had finally won all the odds against me. Over time, I also took subtle revenge on those who had slighted me most. Not with shouting or public humiliation, but with cold, silent cuts. The arrogant vice president was reassigned to a remote branch, where he dealt with troubled clients and tight margins. The CFO, who used to laugh at my accent, was replaced by a brilliant executive he had dismissed years earlier. It was clear to most that my reign was not just about profit, but about reorganizing the game according to my own rules. And my rules did not tolerate slights. Interestingly, many of the rank-and-file employees who had previously not even noticed me now approached me with looks of complicity, almost gratitude. I didn't delude myself into thinking it was out of love or loyalty. It was because they knew I understood what it was like to be on the other side. And in a way, it was true. I began creating internal programs to give voice and opportunities to those who, like me, had once been invisible. Not out of pure kindness, but because this was the most efficient way to maintain a silent army willing to defend my leadership from any internal threat. The cycle was complete. I was the predator who emerged from the midst of the prey. What no one realized was that behind all that shiny corporate structure and impressive numbers, my true delight lay in manipulating the undercurrents that moved the market. I was no longer just the owner of that company. I was the invisible cog that redirected entire flows of capital, determining which suppliers would thrive and which would wither away. That was how I began to consolidate an even larger empire. Using the information that circulated in discreet meetings, where million-dollar deals were sealed with silent handshakes. I became part of the private dinners in restaurants with private rooms far from the public eye, places where wine bottles cost more than my former annual salary. There, with a controlled smile and a fixed gaze, I listened to secrets that I would later use to negotiate mergers or destroy entire careers. The funny thing was that, despite having achieved what so many people wanted, I didn't feel that light happiness that some people describe in motivational speeches. What I felt was a deep sense of belonging, as if I was finally occupying the place that destiny had reserved for me. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about showing myself that I was right when, years before, I heard their laughter echoing through the halls and silently decided that one day it would end. But power is a dangerous currency, and I soon began to see fear creep into my own managers. They watched me with a tense reverence, fearful of making a mistake that might cost them their jobs. They began to fawn over me, bringing detailed reports without my asking, praising my decisions in meetings even when I could tell by the slight tremor in their hands that they didn't completely agree. I let this go on for a while, because it served my purpose. Fear maintains discipline, where respect cannot. But I also began to carefully cultivate a few sincere allies, people I knew were ambitious but not treacherous. I offered them immense opportunities, roles that had previously been out of reach, incentives tied to aggressive results. In doing so, I created a loyal inner circle who were determined to protect my leadership as if it were the only way to secure their own future. In the midst of all this, there was still the perverse satisfaction of receiving former executives and clients who had once looked down on me. Now, they came to my office to present proposals, trying to convince me to invest, to save projects that were sinking. I watched each tense face, their gazes averted from mine as if it were too uncomfortable to look at the woman who used to serve them coffee and could now decide whether their companies would live or die. In many cases, I listened patiently, leafed through contracts with feigned interest and, in the end, simply refused. I didn't need to justify myself. True power is silent, and my refusal was enough to make them pale, knowing that it meant doors would close in a cascade across the market. Meanwhile, my company was flourishing like never before. Profits soared quarter after quarter, our stock hit all-time highs, and analysts tried to explain how a company that just a few years ago was being eaten away by debt and lawsuits had become a financial juggernaut. They didn't know what I knew. The real driving force was not just marketing strategy, but a mind fueled by years of humiliation, pent-up anger, and a thirst for absolute control. Every decision I made was charged with an almost dark energy, an implacable determination to never be that invisible receptionist again. And even on the rare days when I allowed myself to return to my old apartment, which I kept untouched as a keepsake, I would sit on the same hard kitchen chair and stare at the peeling walls, trying to feel some trace of the woman who had once dreamed all this with her heart racing. But there was nothing of her there anymore. What remained was the cold certainty that I had been transformed completely, not by the force of chance, but by the silent violence I had cultivated within myself. Time passed, and with it came new opportunities to consolidate my dominance. The old company where I was treated like trash became a robust conglomerate, encompassing businesses in technology, logistics, and even commercial real estate, all orbiting around the core I had built. No major strategic decision in the industry was made without my name being whispered in some boardroom. Not because I shouted or imposed myself in a blatant manner, but because the market learned to fear the silent reach of my hands. If a competitor dared to cross the path I was paving, I pulled invisible strings, forged underhanded alliances, offered irresistible terms to strategic suppliers, and thus drained the rival's oxygen until there was nothing left but undervalued assets ready for me to buy at a fraction of the price. In the middle of this game, I realized that the feeling of revenge, which had previously burned like hot coals, began to give way to something even deeper and more dangerous, the tranquility of supremacy. I no longer needed to seek revenge against anyone in particular. The simple fact of breathing the same air as those who had despised me, now in positions far below me, was a constant reminder that I had won. Once, the former commercial director, who loved to comment loudly on my nice little body to make his colleagues laugh, was forced to sit across from me in a glass room, next to the new board, to defend the recovery plan of the small bankrupt startup he was trying to save. While he spoke, I kept my eyes fixed on him, without a single smile, just waiting for the presentation to end so I could refuse the investment in an almost monotonous way. I watched as the color drained from his face and understood that this humiliation was worth more than any revenge speech. But my transformation was not just financial. I began to frequent spaces that would previously have been inaccessible even to my wildest dreams. I was invited to international forums, panels restricted to billionaires and ministers, where global strategies were drawn up far from public scrutiny. There I discovered another universe of power, where entire companies changed hands with a single signature, where laws were interpreted according to the interests of those with the most influence. I became known not only as the woman who resurrected a dying business, but as the strategist willing to make cruel cuts to ensure growth. Some admired me, others feared me, everyone respected me, and this respect was the most precious currency of all. At the same time, I began cultivating a private intelligence network, hiring compliance experts, independent auditors, and even forensic analysts to discreetly monitor the movements of partners and competitors. It wasn't paranoia, it was caution. In an environment where cover deals hid calculated betrayals, I couldn't risk being caught off guard. Every report that landed on my desk revealed small cracks in seemingly solid companies, suspicious accounting details, leaked emails that exposed shady intentions. I used this data as collateral to shield my operations or as bargaining chips to force advantageous alliances. In this way, my empire grew not only through traditional acquisitions, but also through the subtle art of corporate blackmail, exercised with such cold precision that no one dared to confront me directly. Even so, I would sometimes find myself alone in my office during silent nights, looking out the window at the labyrinth of city lights, and thinking about the real price of all this. There was no longer any innocence in me, no room for illusions of ordinary happiness. I had exchanged any possibility of a simple life for this silent throne, where there was no tenderness, only the certainty that no one would ever put me down again. Whether that made me equal or worse than those who had once humiliated me didn't matter. All that mattered was that, in the game they themselves had created, I was now the only one who dictated the rules. The wheels kept turning in my favor, fueled by decisions that most people wouldn't have the courage to make. Meanwhile, the company's former board of directors, which had once ruled with an iron fist over defenseless employees, was falling apart along pathetic trajectories. Some tried to rebuild their careers at rival companies, but their names were tarnished by scandals that I had discreetly helped to inflate through selective leaks to the press. Others sank into personal debt, unable to sustain the standard of living built on obscene bonuses and internal fraud. In financial circles, it was rumored that the executive who had once laughed at my accent was now selling small consulting services, begging for meetings with investors who didn't even return her emails. All of this happened without me having to directly move a single piece. I was simply setting the stage for them to stumble over their own neglect, like hungry rats surrounded by poisoned bait. But as the conglomerate grew, new types of enemies emerged. Not those who had underestimated me in the past, but tycoons and sovereign wealth funds who had no problem crushing competitors to increase their margins. They tried to co-opt me, first with flattery, then with promises of advantageous mergers, until finally they began to covertly threaten my most vulnerable assets. But I was prepared. I had redesigned the structure of the holding company so intricately that each division was shielded by intersecting statutes, complex trusts and international agreements that turned any hostile attempt into a legal maze with no way out. While they hired lawyers and made hostile offers, I acted quietly, buying up critical suppliers, locking in supply exclusivity deals that slowly killed the profitability of their projects. Eventually, their balance sheets turned red, their stocks plummeted, and the only way out was to retreat. Swallowing their pride, my name began to circulate behind the scenes as someone who was better to negotiate with preemptively than to face in the open. In the midst of all this, I continued to nurture the internal army of competent professionals, but not out of compassion. I discovered that employees who know they have a real chance to grow and prosper defend their leader more strongly than any contractual clause. I instituted progressive bonuses, profit sharing for departments that met aggressive targets, and placed social projects under the company's umbrella, not because I had altruistic dreams, but because I realized the weight of positive public relations and the moral shield it created against critics. In this way, the public saw my organization as a pillar of opportunity and jobs, something almost untouchable by public opinion. Meanwhile, competitors who tried to attack me found themselves crushed not only by my market structure, but by the popular sympathy that shielded my movements. It was a double play. At the same time that I became feared in the upper echelons of finance, I became a symbol of advancement and strength for thousands of small employees and communities dependent on our operations. Over the years, I accumulated properties in various parts of the world, from offices in financial centers to logistics complexes in strategic ports. I also acquired a quiet stake in technology startups that mapped consumer data on an almost obscene scale, giving me a granular view of the habits of millions. This information fed into internal reports that allowed me to anticipate trends, pivot businesses before fads passed, and even reshape entire industries to capture emerging demands. I began to be invited to global security forums, where heads of state gathered to discuss not only trade but geopolitical stability, and there, among leaders who moved armies, I realized the true weight of those who control essential supply chains. It was no longer just about avenging my past, it was about keeping the empire alive and ensuring that no one would ever dare threaten my throne. At some point, I noticed that my own routine had become almost ritualistic, structured to extract maximum efficiency from my days and minimum vulnerability. I would wake up before sunrise, read confidential reports while the city was still asleep, and hold virtual meetings with executives spread across time zones. So different that my internal clocks had become indifferent to morning or early morning. My calendar was a wall of appointments, but each meeting, each business lunch in a discreet restaurant, was another piece on the global chessboard that I was moving. There was no such thing as casual conversation. Each word exchanged, each silent toast with expensive glasses carried coded messages, implicit agreements, and promises of future alignments. Even the moments that seemed like relaxation, like weekends at exclusive retreats, or small parties on yachts with meticulously selected guests were, in reality, extensions of my office. I observed, absorbing who got too close, who retreated, who whispered, and then used these perceptions to anticipate movements before they even solidified into concrete threats. Over time, I began to collect stories of small, quiet coups I had executed against rivals. A biotech company that dared to try to outdo me in patents was broken up after I quietly bought up its overdue debt, demanding immediate payment and enforcing contractual clauses they never imagined anyone would use so rigorously. An investment fund that planned a hostile attack on one of my divisions ended up imploding from within after I leaked to analysts the weaknesses in its balance sheets, sending investors fleeing in panic. I didn't have to shout or directly threaten anyone. All I had to do was gently pull the strings of the immense global financial fabric I already controlled, and watch the waves of destruction advance until my enemies surrendered or disappeared. On a personal level, however, the cost of this escalation became undeniable. My old friendships had almost completely disappeared, dissolved by irreconcilable agendas and, in some cases, by fear of what I had become. Distant family members avoided deep conversations, uncomfortable with the fact that I was no longer the same insecure young woman who had needed their couch to sleep on when she arrived in New York with 2 battered suitcases and limited English. Even in the brief relationships I dared to attempt, I quickly felt the weight of the crushing asymmetry. There was no room for anyone who was not shaped by the same cold steel of ambition. Most of the men I encountered, no matter how powerful in their circles, were quickly intimidated by my unbridled independence, or tried, futilely, to reduce me to a domesticated version that would never exist. When this happened, I just smiled and let them go, knowing that it was for the best. Meanwhile, my influence was spreading beyond the corporate walls. I began to quietly fund political campaigns, not out of ideology, but to secure legislation favorable to my projects. I donated generously to causes of social impact, knowing that every hospital or educational program opened bore my name on gold plaques, shielding my image from any future investigation. More than once, investigative journalists came dangerously close to scandals that could tarnish my reputation, only to find closed doors and sources who suddenly gave up talking, pressured by confidentiality agreements tied with suffocating fines, or, in more delicate cases, persuaded by financial offers too generous to refuse. And so I kept my crown intact. Inside me, there was no longer the primal heat of anger that had driven me in the beginning. In its place was something much colder and more calculated, the conviction that the world did not reward the righteous, but rather those willing to dirty their hands with tough decisions. Those who watched from the outside saw only the glitter of monumental achievements, the headlines extolling the visionary businesswoman who had transformed a reception into a throne. But only I knew the exact price, paid in solitude, sleepless nights, and a transformation so profound that if I had met the younger version of myself, I probably wouldn't have recognized her. My career had reached a point where invitations to global forums, private dinners with finance ministers, and secret meetings with central bank presidents were no longer exceptions, but a natural part of my calendar. Each trip on private planes, to meetings in Geneva, Dubai, or Singapore was carried out with impeccable ritual. Advisors reviewed contracts on the flight, while analysts prepared secret reports for me on the political and fiscal situation of the country I would be visiting. There was no longer any naivety in the looks that greeted me upon arrival. Entire governments knew that if they wanted to attract factories, distribution centers, or financial headquarters capable of irrigating their economies, I was the one they needed to sit down and negotiate with. Not that I felt pure pride. I was as far beyond such romantic feelings as a surgeon during a high-risk operation. I limited myself to focusing on the next precise cut, the next structural adjustment that would keep my empire pulsing with strength. It was at one of these meetings, in an ornate palace in Eastern Europe, that I realized how far I had passed the point of no return. As I discussed tax terms with a minister draped in centuries-old tapestries, I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he leafed through the clauses of our contract. They were not shaking simply from political nervousness, but from something deeper, the fear of someone who understands that he is facing a force that does not respond to patriotism or doctrines, only to projections of profits and expansion of influence. In that moment, I understood that I had become what I had so often criticized in my mind in the early years, a stateless, ruthless power that saw borders as logistical inconveniences and legislation as technical obstacles to be circumvented or adapted. Yet I felt no guilt. After all, every decision I made had been shaped by years of no one caring about my dignity, by meetings where I was ignored, by jokes that used my accent as a ladder for laughter. The world had trained me to be exact and ruthless. When I returned to New York after that trip, I found my conglomerate more prosperous than ever. Stocks were breaking records, rating agencies were raising our ratings, and even traditional investors who had previously doubted my governance were now sending emissaries with large proposals to participate in my projects. Inside the mirrored building that had once been nothing more than a hostile sanctuary for me, silent hallways displayed panels with rising charts, awards, corporate trophies, but none of them could capture the true essence of what I had built. These were not just businesses, they were modern fiefdoms, economic territories, where my word carried the weight of law, where executives educated at the best universities on the planet awaited my decisions like submissive subjects. Interestingly, amidst all this colossal structure, I maintained habits that came from the time when I counted pennies to take the subway. I still drank the same strong black coffee, without sugar or expensive spices. I still preferred to analyze printed contracts, with handwritten notes scribbled in ordinary pens, instead of luxurious digital screens. Some mistook this for humility, but it was just a way of not completely forgetting the path. Not that I missed it. It was almost the opposite. I made a point of maintaining these rituals to remind myself of how much I had to bleed emotionally to get there. Without these daily memories, I ran the risk of believing in empty narratives about innate genius or enlightened destiny. Nothing could be further from the truth. My throne had been carved from overlapping layers of humiliation, feverish study, and a stubbornness that bordered on self-destructive. There was, however, one moment that nearly cracked my shell. I received a handwritten letter, delivered without fanfare by one of the receptionists on the lower floor. It was from the lady who had worked as a cleaner during my first years in that building. She vividly reminded me of the afternoons when I would find myself huddled behind the counter, trying to hold back tears after yet another public scolding. She wrote to quietly thank me because, unlike the previous administration, my administration had given her full health insurance and early retirement, which allowed her to care for her sick husband. I closed the letter with my hands shaking, not with guilt or regret, but with a strange melancholy that threatened to turn into human feeling. I took a deep breath, swallowed it, and headed off to yet another meeting where I would decide the future of entire factories with the stroke of a pen. Over the next few months, I continued to expand my domain so meticulously that each new contract felt like a perfectly fitting piece in the gigantic mosaic I had been building since the day I decided never to be diminished again. At the same time, I built unlikely alliances with sovereign wealth funds that, despite different cultures and languages, shared the same primal instinct to protect and multiply capital. I struck deals with energy tycoons, and I secured minority stakes in regional banks that might seem insignificant in isolation but, when combined, gave me quiet influence over flows of credit and financing on 3 continents. This kind of web didn't appear on newspaper front pages or in glossy reports. It was the underbelly of power, driven by hermetic spreadsheets, obscure clauses, and discreet handshakes in camera-free rooms. As I walked through these environments, I noticed how my presence changed the dynamics of the meetings. I was no longer the woman who had to prove her competence. All I had to do was walk in, and the tone would change. Conversations would drop a half tone. Advisors would come forward to offer better seats. Waiters would tremble slightly as they served glasses. I began to observe this with an almost clinical detachment, curious to understand at what exact point I stopped being underestimated and became feared. Perhaps it was when I managed to save a transnational merger that was about to founder due to regulatory obstacles, by personally calling a minister who owed me old favors. Perhaps it was when, without hesitation, I closed loss-making operations in 2 countries, laying off thousands to turn the numbers around and show the market that I would not tolerate financial bleeding. The fact is that it was consolidated in an imperceptible but irreversible moment. From that moment on, the corporate world understood that my name was synonymous with final decisions. Still, certain ghosts from the past found their way to visit me. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing reports on mergers in Southeast Asia, I came across a resume left on my desk by mistake. It was from a young woman applying for an internship from another country, with shaky English and spotty academic records. It hit me so unexpectedly that I had to close my eyes for a moment. I saw there the exact reflection of what I had once been, an outsider with nothing but urgency and fear. When I opened my eyes again, the document was still there, motionless, almost accusatory. I took a deep breath and let my instincts take over. I gave the order for her to be hired and placed under the direct supervision of HR. With intensive language and corporate culture courses, but I never knew that it was because of my intervention. I did it not out of kindness or redemption, but out of a twisted residue of memory, a way of ensuring that the cycle could repeat itself, but under less cruel conditions than those I had faced. Meanwhile, my conglomerate continued to absorb smaller rivals in quiet transactions. Often disguised as strategic partnerships, I kept local CEOs to give the appearance of continuity, but all decision-making was centralized in me. This ensured that any attempts at internal rebellion were crushed before they could become a real threat. I established cross-audit systems so complex that even regional boards could not manipulate results without alarm bells going off on my confidential financial dashboards. I used artificial intelligence to map suspicious patterns in transactions and bolstered legal teams with lawyers who had a reputation for pulverizing prosecutors with preliminary appeals alone. It wasn't paranoia, it was reassurance. I knew the bitter taste of vulnerability too well to allow for loopholes. In the rare moments when work slowed down, I would gaze out at the city from the penthouse I had acquired. A colossal duplex with panoramic windows, from which I could see the beating heart of New York spread out in endless lights. Sometimes I would imagine how many other eyes looked up at night, unaware that there, in that silent room, a woman who had once been called a simple receptionist was running operations that could make or break entire local economies. It was a power so absolute that it ached in my bones, loaded not with joy but with a harsh, almost suffocating responsibility. Even so, I embraced it without hesitation, aware that to give it up would be the same as handing my fate over to people who, in the past, had not hesitated to step on me. Continue to the next paragraph. It wasn't long before my influence reached such a level that I began to be sought out not only by executives desperate to save struggling companies, but also by entire governments eager to secure investments capable of rescuing their fragile economies. Prime ministers sent ambassadors carrying proposals for tax breaks, flexible legislation, and logistical incentives. I received them in discreet rooms, without flags or national symbols that might remind me of the fragile borders they were trying so hard to protect. There, they spoke in controlled voices, trying to negotiate terms that would convince me to build industrial parks or technology centers in their regions, promising cheap labor and political stability guaranteed by often questionable regimes, all in exchange for the simple choice of building the next hub of my empire there. I observed each of them with the same calm gaze that I had learned to cultivate, mentally noting which ones could be useful as long-term pawns and which ones weren't worth the risk of investing, no matter how tempting the facilities offered. It was in this environment that I noticed something curious. Those who seemed to dominate their countries the most, with fiery speeches and nationalist speeches to their voters, were often the most vulnerable at the negotiating table. All I had to do was show them spreadsheets detailing how much of the local GDP would depend on the jobs and taxes generated by my projects for the expression of bravery to disappear, replaced by an almost palpable anxiety. Then came the additional concessions. Secret requests for parallel investments that would benefit relatives or interest groups, all accompanied by discreet pledges of loyalty to my conglomerate. Each of these agreements sealed not only the expansion of my business, but also the political web that kept larger adversaries at bay. Fearful of coming into direct conflict with someone who controlled such essential links in global production chains. Within my own structure, the level of discipline I implemented was compared by consultants to military regimes. There was no room for prolonged lapses. Regional leaders were evaluated by algorithms that tracked not only financial targets, but also decision-making patterns, unexplained absences from critical meetings, even nuances of language in emails that could suggest a shift in loyalty. Many dismissed this as paranoia, but the truth is that these tools allowed me to anticipate silent betrayals before they turned into plots. Some tried, of course. There was the case of a European executive who, seduced by promises from rival funds, tried to leak strategic reports. His contract was terminated one gray morning based on clauses he signed without reading. And within a week, his name was circulating on compliance risk lists throughout the financial sector, making him virtually unemployable. I didn't have to say anything. The system took care of isolating him like a rejected foreign body. At the same time, I maintained strong incentives for those who demonstrated genuine loyalty. It was almost a silent code of honor. Those who advanced with me prospered, and received bonuses so aggressive that they changed entire generations of their families. I saw managers who started out organizing small branches become regional presidents, building hospitals and schools in their communities with resources that my holding company made available. This balance between fear and reward shaped a peculiar, almost reverential corporate culture that meant that my name circulated in internal meetings not as a title but as an inescapable force, so integrated into the processes that few dared even question it. Curiously, it was in this environment of absolute control that I felt a peculiar kind of loneliness emerge. Not the romantic loneliness of someone who yearns for loving company, but a kind of intellectual abyss. There was no one else around me who stood on a real level with me. Even the boards of directors, made up of powerful and wealthy figures beyond the common understanding, behaved with rehearsed caution in front of me. Their conversations were polite, each sentence carefully structured so as not to sound like open criticism. I listened to them, pondered their suggestions. But deep down, I knew that all crucial decisions continued to pass exclusively through my scrutiny. This concentration of absolute power, although it guaranteed the fulfillment of my purpose, also reinforced the feeling that with each step I took, I was moving further away from the ordinary world. From that simple humanity that I once shared with the girl at the reception desk, with whom everyone laughed and mocked, but who at least was surrounded by peers who shared the same insignificant weight. This solitude became so intrinsic to my routine that I began to treat it as just another asset in my portfolio, something I controlled, managed, and cultivated because I knew how dangerous it would be to allow too much intimacy in a world where any personal connection could become a lever for blackmail. For this reason, my interactions outside of the business environment were strictly calculated. I attended art fairs, charity dinners, and book launches, but always maintained the kind of presence that absorbs everything and offers little in return. I chatted with politicians, artists, and renowned academics, smiled in photos published in high-end magazines. But I left these events the same way I had entered, intact, without any real ties. It was as if each occasion were just a temporary stage where I displayed the public persona I had carefully constructed, allowing the real machinery to continue turning behind the scenes, far from the reach of any unwanted curiosity. In fact, while these images circulated in the society columns, reinforcing my aura as an inaccessible and powerful woman, my true power was fueled by numbers that no one outside the inner circle of the corporate elite could fully understand. I observed macroeconomic indicators, currency flows, international credit costs, and futures contracts for essential commodities that set the tone for food and fuel prices across entire continents. Often, when major media outlets reported changes in unemployment or inflation rates in distant countries, I already knew the reasons before their own finance ministers could even form theories. Because part of that pressure was created or exacerbated by the strategic choices I authorized when directing investments, closing supply contracts, or suspending operations to renegotiate margins. There was nothing illegal about that, just the natural weight of an empire that had become so vast that its movements had repercussions beyond its visible borders. But this colossal scale also carried a disturbing serenity. When I realized how much I could shape realities for millions of people without even knowing them, I understood that I had long since moved beyond the stage of personal revenge. The man who once said I would never be more than a receptionist, the director who laughed at my accent, all those minor characters had been swept to the margins of history, replaced by rulers, multinational CEOs, and heads of trillion-dollar funds who now discreetly bowed their heads when negotiating with me. It was no longer a question of punishing specific individuals, but of playing a game whose only rule was not to show weakness. In this sense, the humiliated receptionist of the past was dead. What remained was an entity that learned from each mistake, that mentally filed away betrayals and, when the time was right, collected them with interest that destroyed reputations and fortunes. Despite all this relentless machinery, I maintained certain almost superstitious nocturnal habits. After the office lights went out and the upper floors fell silent, I liked to walk alone through the glass-enclosed rooms, looking out at the lit-up city below, breathing in the thin air of the skyscrapers. Sometimes I would sit in one of the dark conference rooms, just listening to the distant sound of traffic, letting my mind sift through old memories that insisted on returning. I would see quick flashes of my first day in that building, of the temporary badge hanging crookedly around my neck, of the first time I had to answer an international call, trembling for fear of making a mistake. Then I would see the vice president's face, barely hiding his contempt. The restrained laughter of the salespeople when I stumbled over technical terms I had not yet mastered. It was a silent torture, but also a necessary ritual to remember what had driven me to climb each step with such disciplined hatred. Eventually, I would leave the room and return to the main office, where confidential documents awaited my review. There, far from cameras, flattery, and the fears of others, I would take full command of my world again, adjusting contracts, approving mergers, and reorganizing entire divisions with a single stroke of a pen. It was an absolute power, but it was also a burden that no one but me could bear. And, paradoxically, this exclusivity gave me a dark peace. Because if there was no one else who could share this burden with me, there was also no one who could take it from me. Continue to the next paragraph. Over the years, what had begun as an empire aggressively engineered to avenge old humiliations had evolved into something much more vast and organic. Almost a living organism that pulsed with its own flows of capital, data, political influence, and quiet fear. I had built networks so complex that even international tax boards could not fully untangle the paths through which they passed, from supply contracts, cross-acquisitions, offshore holdings, and sovereign wealth fund stakes that controlled everything from refineries to global food distribution chains. Each piece was there for a reason. They protected each other, creating an ecosystem in which attacking one end inevitably meant colliding with the interests of giant banks, dependent governments, and global corporations that had no desire to see their balance sheets torn apart by indirect retaliation. This environment allowed me to operate with an almost mechanical coolness. If a region showed signs of instability or rising labor costs, I would reconfigure production chains for another part of the planet, inject capital into rival infrastructures, encourage local chambers of commerce to offer incentives for my projects, and let the previous economies wither away on their own, pressured by unemployment and bankruptcies of suppliers who could not survive without my recurring orders. This was not gratuitous cruelty. It was the logical cost of optimization. The same one I had learned in my first night classes when I tried, still in the miserable anonymity of the reception, to understand the merciless logic of global finance. There they taught that profits do not tolerate sentimentality, that companies that do not adapt die, and that survival and growth depend on decisions that few have the stomach to make. I did, but there was also something subtle and perverse about all this. An almost intellectual pleasure in seeing how decisions made by me, often in quick 15-minute meetings, had repercussions in global economic reports, changed prices in the futures market, and generated anxious analyses in distant universities. While academics tried to predict whether my holding companies would expand or reduce operations in certain regions, I was already 3 moves ahead, protecting critical assets and releasing lines of credit in sectors that had no idea they would be the next beneficiaries. The predictability of the rest of the world was my greatest asset. Governments had to justify budgets, publicly held companies had to account to shareholders, and institutional funds obeyed rigid statutes. I, on the other hand, had no explanations to give to anyone. My holding company was private, fully controlled by structures that gave me the decisive vote in any meeting, and surrounded by clauses that made it impossible to try to dilute my power. If I wanted to, I could stop everything on a whim, destroy billions in market value just to teach a lesson. He did not, but the mere knowledge that he had this absolute power was in itself an anchor that kept everyone obedient. This understanding also shaped the way I dealt with reputational crises. Unlike large multinationals that tremble at the slightest sign of protest, I learned to calibrate narratives. I maintained robust donations to universities, environmental NGOs, and community development projects. I financed artists, museums, and international scholarships. All of this was strategically spread across hundreds of small initiatives that, when added together, built a nearly impregnable shield. When a reporter did eventually try to dig up negative stories, they found networks of economic dependence so intricate that many sources declined to speak for fear of losing sponsorships, jobs, or future contracts. And even when a negative story did appear, it rarely gained traction beyond a short cycle of superficial outrage. The public was quickly distracted by the next shocking headline, while my operations continued unscathed. At such times, I remembered that frightened young woman, the receptionist who felt diminished every time a manager so much as gave her an indifferent glance. I thought of how terrified she must have been to glimpse who she would become, how alien the life I led would seem. The intriguing thing was that there was no triumphant pride in this comparison, only an inevitable acceptance. The world, as I found it, offered no safe space for those who refused to toughen up. So I toughened up, more than anyone else, and so I reigned. Still, in rare intervals of absolute silence, small cracks would appear through which old memories would creep in, almost like hallucinations. This would often happen during the early hours of the morning, when the city was asleep and my office looked like a glass reliquary suspended above distant lights. At those times, I would hold billion-dollar contracts in my hands, and for a second, the weight of those papers would remind me of the pads of files I used to handle at reception, writing down appointments and confirming visits. Sometimes, I would smell the cheap coffee I was making in a secluded corner, or the sound of laughter echoing in the hallways while I pretended not to hear it. Then, as an automatic defense, my mind would retreat to the comforting coldness of numbers. To the mathematical projections that didn't mock or underestimate anyone, they simply obeyed those who knew how to decipher them. And I knew it. I knew it so well that, over time, this mastery became almost an extension of my senses. I saw probable futures the way others observed the weather through a window. At that point, there were no longer any boards deliberating on whether or not a project should move forward. I decided, and there were no boards contesting. My meetings became formal procedures, where only the aim was to officially validate what my word had already made a done deal. This turned my figure into a kind of silent myth, whispered about in the corridors of international banks, in financing rounds, in negotiations between ministers who feared losing critical investments. Some called it visionary leadership, others called it corporate authoritarianism. To me, it was nothing more than efficiency distilled to its purest form. Every weakness eliminated, every doubt silenced, every hesitation removed was fuel for the next cycle of expansion. Yet there was also an inevitable byproduct of this structure without real challenge: intellectual isolation. Surrounded by vice presidents who competed to anticipate my wishes, by CFOs who adjusted reports before they were even questioned, I felt the absence of genuine debate. The few times someone dared to point out an alternative path, they did so with such care and reverence that the real value of the counterpoint was lost amid the fear of displeasing. This lack of real friction ended up reinforcing a peculiar kind of loneliness. Not social loneliness, because there were always dozens of people around, but the loneliness of the absolute certainty that there was no one like me out there. Someone capable of disagreeing head-on, and making me reconsider a course through solid arguments, not through disguised servitude. Perhaps it was this emptiness that led me to cultivate an even more eccentric habit over time, analyzing in human resources reports, cases of anonymous employees who showed small signs of rebellion or nonconformity. They were low-level employees who complained about rigid processes, middle managers who questioned goals, technicians who proposed alternative solutions, ignored by fearful managers. In many of these cases, I silently ordered them to be reassigned to internal leadership acceleration programs. I wanted to observe who would thrive under pressure, who would have the courage to defy obsolete guidelines if the chance arose. I did this not out of benevolence, but out of vital necessity. It was my way of ensuring that, in the future, at least a few genuine voices would emerge who could strain the system before it became fragile due to excessive blind obedience. Meanwhile, my businesses were taking root in sectors that escaped the public's superficial scrutiny. I invested in agricultural supply chains that set basic prices in entire markets, in port distribution centers that were logistical bottlenecks for entire continents. I also quietly funded advanced technological research, not just for the patents and profits, but for access to strategic data that supercomputers generated from global consumption patterns, population migrations, and climate change. These reports fed simulations that gave me a colossal advantage in predicting crises before they exploded in the news. So I was already positioned to profit or avoid damage, while governments were still setting up committees to study the situation. At this point, the old personal narrative of revenge had become almost a minor detail in my mental universe. It was just the prologue to something much larger, almost unrecognizable to someone who, years before, had held the telephone with sweaty hands, fearing to make a mistake. Now, My hands held the fate of entire sectors of the world economy, adjusting them to my whim with the same ease with which someone chooses the temperature of the air conditioning in a conference room, with the accumulation of so much silent power. I noticed that the very way I related to time changed drastically. The future stopped being a hopeful or fearful abstraction and became just a graph projected in reports. Ascending or descending curves that were shaped according to the strategic interventions I decided to implement. I lost the anxiety that used to accompany any uncertainty. Now, I anticipated scenarios with such cutting clarity that it was almost monotonous. If a government was politically unstable, I already had contracts protected by advantageous termination clauses. If a currency threatened to devalue, my hedge funds were already positioned to profit from the fall. In moments that brought down traditional conglomerates, I simply adjusted parameters and moved forward, without hesitation or surprise. This coldness eventually extended to all aspects of my life. Little by little, I stopped pretending to have social interests that I had previously cultivated out of protocol. I reduced my appearances at festive events and declined invitations to lavish parties that had previously served as fertile ground for consolidating alliances. I realized that I no longer needed to be physically present to maintain the magnetism of my name. All it took was an email, a short video call, an indirect signal sent by my directors for entire boards of directors to change strategies or align themselves with my wishes. This intangible authority, almost mystical to those observing from the outside, gave me the freedom to retreat even further into my own domain, building almost monastic routines. I would spend days in silent meeting rooms, flanked by assistants carrying stacks of encrypted reports, interactive graphs projected on dashboards, simulators running forecasts fed by global data that no single university or research institute had. In these sessions, my face remained impassive as I made decisions that could mean prosperity or bankruptcy for hundreds of smaller companies, which in turn supported tens of thousands of families. It was not a sadistic power. It was simply a consequence of the scale I had achieved. On the chessboard that had been formed, there was no room for sentimental dilemmas. If an Asian supplier had repeated logistical failures, even if justified by natural disasters or local political crises, it was replaced by a more efficient one. The global chain reorganized itself almost organically in response, and I watched it all as if I were moving pieces of a gigantic puzzle, where what mattered was the final fit, not the microscopic drama of each displaced piece. At the same time, this distancing from genuine human interaction was creating a shell so thick that I sometimes found it strange. I vaguely remembered the visceral empathy I once felt, the ability to suffer with personal stories or individual injustices. Now, I heard reports about protests, local bankruptcies, rising unemployment rates in peripheral countries, but I processed everything in terms of metrics, as if they were just red or green numbers on dashboards. Part of this was self-defense, part a natural evolution for someone who managed such vast operations that emotional involvement would be fatal. Still, in a forgotten corner of my mind, I recognized that perhaps I had lost something fundamental along the way, an inner delicacy that made the world less arid. But as soon as this thought arose, it was drowned out by spreadsheets, emergency reports, and unpostponable meetings. Little by little, I became a living extension of the very system I had created. It was no longer possible to tell where the formal structures of the holding company ended and my personal will began. My direct advisors, exhaustively trained to anticipate preferences and patterns, were already operating almost telepathically, delivering documents and proposing solutions before I could even ask questions. Sometimes I would go hours without saying a word, just nodding or shaking my head, while monumental decisions piled up: mergers, closures, expansion into unstable markets that promised exponential returns but also enormous risks. I accepted the risk without hesitation. Perhaps because deep down I understood that this was the only way to feel some kind of authentic pulse. A remnant of the old flame that made me leave the reception desk ready to consume the world until there was nothing left that could embarrass me again. Continue to the next paragraph.